are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the Dibble Institute's second Wednesday webinar featuring Dr. Laurence Steinberg, author of our webinar title, Age of Opportunity, Lessons from the New Science of Adolescence. My name is Irene Varley, Director of Education for the Dibble Institute, and also behind the curtain here is Kathy Guidry, our webinar organizer, who keeps us all connected. Hey, Kathy.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Just some brief information for the webinar. If you're unable during the broadcast at any time able to access the audio through your computer, you may want to note this phone number and access code because you can call in on your phone and watch the webinar on your screen on your computer at the same time. To let you know that you are muted, and we're going to keep you muted during the broadcast. But we really want you to participate. So questions that may come up for you, you can type in the question box. But here's a little help that hint for you. Because we don't want to interrupt Dr. Lawrence's presentation during the presentation, we're going to ask you to jot down your questions, and then at the end of the presentation, if you would enter them into the question box. Do you note that on your control panel? If you would just drop that down and put your question in, and we will, at the end of the broadcast, have about 10 minutes or maybe a few more minutes to address your questions as well as we can. Any questions that we don't address, we will try and get back to you. We will have those recorded on our survey box. To let you know, this webinar will be archived at dibbleinstitute.org/webinars-archives in case you want to revisit it and or were unable to stick with us through the whole broadcast. Well, let me just begin a little bit for those of you who are new to us to give you a brief introduction to the Dibble Institute. On your screen right now, you'll see Charlie and Helen Dibble. Charlie is our founder and was an engineer by trade, and as an engineer, he sought solutions. Some 30 years ago, he saw how young people's relationships and those of their parents were affecting the outcomes of young people, and not all in positive ways, unfortunately. So he began asking lead experts in the field of education, what are we doing to help young people develop skills for creating stable families? So here, the Dibble Institute is 30 years later helping young people to have access to research and evidence-based relationship education materials. The Dibble Institute is a national, independent, nonprofit, mission-driven organization. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it? We are able to reach many young people thanks to your efforts in partnering with us. We could not have reached the 1.5 million young people that we have in the last 10 years without you. So many thanks to all of you and the work you're doing. Very briefly, our core values are that we do very much believe in research, just like the research you will hear from Dr. Steinberg today. We rely on that research to keep our materials up to date and relevant. We also believe in stable, healthy families. The diversity of family formation today makes it ever more important to follow the research. Next slide, please. And research continues to show that children do best when raised with the healthy involvement of both biological parents, and that their relationships with each other matters. Research also shows that children do best when parents are together, although we know this isn't always the case. I have to emphasize this means we are not anti-divorce. We do understand that not all families have two parents in the household. Research and experience supports that complex, high conflict, abusive situations are not good for children. And so we applaud the many single parents who do great jobs and have great outcomes with their children. But single parenting, especially without the healthy support of a co-parent, can be very stressful and difficult on both parent and child. The Dibble Institute believes that all people deserve to be treated with respect, no matter their sexual orientation. All relationships get better, stronger, and healthier when youth have access to a healthy relationship education that develops the same motivational capacities Dr. Steinberg identifies as essential for successful futures for our youth. So now let's hear directly from Dr. Steinberg, who is an esteemed professor of psychology at Temple University in Philadelphia. I am especially grateful to Dr. Steinberg for sharing his work with us today, as I know that as a writer of 350 scholarly articles, a dozen books, his many contributions of articles in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Psychology Today, appearances on NPR, and other webinar presentations, he is a very busy man. And as a personal note, I would like to add that I was drawn to Dr. Steinberg's book, Age of Opportunity, Lessons from the New Science of Adolescence, through a presentation he gave to a juvenile justice group about the plasticity of the adolescent brain. In reading his book myself, I found such relevance and correlation to my work with the Dibble Institute and the public programs we publish. And I hope you too will find that in the presentation today. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Steinberg.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I want to talk about some new ideas about the way we think about adolescence. These ideas are developed more fully in the book Age of Opportunity. And if you want to pursue any of the ideas that I discuss in today's webinar further, that's a very good place to start. You can also go to my website, which is below the book on your screen here, and you can download any of the research articles that our lab has published that discusses in scientific detail the kind of work that we're doing. So let's talk about new ways of thinking about adolescence. One of the points that is new is that adolescence is a second period of heightened brain plasticity. Many of you know that the brain is a very malleable organ and that it changes in response to experience, and you've probably heard or read that the first part of life is a time of great brain malleability. But recently, scientists have discovered that there's a second period of plasticity, and that is during adolescence. As I'll explain later in the talk, adolescence is longer today than it's ever been before. It starts earlier and it goes later. And this elongation of adolescence makes this plasticity especially important because it provides an opportunity for us to intervene, and also it creates a period of vulnerability where we need to protect kids from toxic environmental events. That's what I mean when I say that plasticity makes adolescence an age of opportunity as well as a time of risk. Plasticity cuts both ways. The brain can't tell the difference between good experiences and bad experiences. So good experiences can turn adolescence into a time of opportunity, but bad experiences can turn into a time of vulnerability. Now, as I'll explain, brain plasticity does not occur in all regions of the brain at the same time, and during adolescence, it's especially significant in regions that govern self-regulation. This is important to keep in mind because one of the chief developmental tasks of adolescence is to develop better and stronger self-control. And self-regulation has been shown to be correlated with all kinds of indicators of success in life: better performance in school, better relationships, better mental health, So we want to do what we can to help facilitate stronger self-control, stronger self-regulation at all ages, but particularly during adolescence, because it's a time when that part of the brain is especially malleable. My main message to you today, and I'll feel like I've been a success if this is what you walk away with above all, and that's that we need to abandon the view that adolescence is a time that is one we are hoping just to survive. I think that's the message that we give to parents. It's the message that we give to kids. And instead of that, I think we ought to be looking at adolescence as a time when people can really thrive. And that's the main takeaway from today's talk. And let me give you an overview of the topics that I'll be covering. I want to start by explaining how I got interested in this work, and that has to do with understanding risk-taking during adolescence, which is a very profound threat to youngsters' well-being. And I'm going to show you how brain science is teaching us how adolescent behavior changes in ways that make young people more inclined to engage in risky and reckless behavior. So we'll take a look at some of the main lessons from adolescent brain science and apply those to understanding risky and reckless behavior. Then I'll turn to the question of brain plasticity, and we'll talk about what it means for the brain to be plastic and why it's so important to think of adolescence as a time of great brain malleability. I'll then discuss the elongation of adolescence, what I refer to as the longest decade, and talk about why adolescence now begins so much earlier and why it lasts so longer, and what the implications of that are for those of you who work with people in this age range. So let's start by talking about adolescent risk-taking, which is how I got involved in this line of work. We've made tremendous progress in developed countries in the treatment and the prevention of illness and disease during adolescence. And if you look at the major threats to morbidity and mortality, what you find is that during adolescence, they are not illness and disease. In fact, it is one of the healthiest periods in the human life cycle. The major threats to morbidity and mortality during adolescence are behavioral in nature. They're things that kids do to themselves and to others. And therefore, if we could do something to diminish the inclination of young people to engage in risky behavior, we could do something to dramatically improve young people's health. What's interesting about adolescent risk-taking is that it is manifested in many, many different ways that on the surface don't seem to have anything to do with each other. Let me show you what I mean by this. We know, for example, that compared to adults, adolescents commit more crimes. So this is a graph showing data from the FBI on rates of arrest as a function of the age of the individual who's been arrested. And what you can see here is that for both property crime and violent crime, arrests increase dramatically between age 10 and the late teen years, and then they decline as people mature into adulthood. And we see this same pattern for both violent crime, shown here in red, and property crime, shown in yellow. We find this age crime curve not only in the United States, but around the developed world. And it's not only true of young people today, it's been true as long as we've been tracking and keeping data on crime. But this is a very robust pattern. But it's not the only pattern that shows an increase in risk-taking and a peak in risk-taking during adolescence. As I'm sure many of you are aware, adolescents have more car crashes than adults do, and automobile crashes are the leading cause of death during adolescence. These are data from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, and they show driver deaths as a function of driver age. And what you see is a curve that looks remarkably similar to the age crime curve, in that it increases, peaks in the late teen years, and then declines as people move into adulthood. So it's not only a higher rate of crime that characterizes these late teen years, it's reckless behavior behind the wheel as well. It's also the case that compared to adults, adolescents have more unintended pregnancies. These are data that have been analyzed by Feiner, but the data come from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, showing rates of unintended pregnancies among sexually active young women and women in their 20s and 30s. And what you see here is that unintended pregnancies increase during the middle adolescent years, peak at around the same age as when we see the peak in crime and we see the peak in driver crashes, and then decline dramatically as individuals move into adulthood. A big surprise to most people is to learn that adolescents actually drown more often than people of other ages. And this is certainly a surprise, given the fact that adolescents generally don't suffer from poor stamina. They're generally quite strong. And yet, as you see here in data, again from the CDC, that unintentional drownings increase during the adolescent years, peak at the same age again as crime, unintended pregnancies, and car crashes, and then decline as well. Now, it seems to me that the only good explanation for why 19-year-olds should drown more than 12-year-olds or 30-year-olds is that 19-year-olds are probably making bad decisions about when and where to swim. That's another example of how risk-taking can compromise the well-being of young people. Adolescents also attempt suicide more often than people of other ages. These are data on non-fatal self-inflicted injuries, things like cutting, and what you see is that this also increases dramatically during the adolescent years, peaks in the late teen years, and then declines as people get older. Another type of adolescent risk-taking. And then finally, as I'm sure you're all well aware, adolescents experiment with drugs more often than people of other ages. These are data from a survey on drug use and health, showing the average age at first use of alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana in the United States. And although some people experiment with these substances at an early age, and other people don't begin experimenting with them or don't use them at all until much later, what you see is for all three of these substances, the most likely time for people to begin experimenting is in the late teen years. My point is simply that across a wide range of different types of risky activity that don't on the surface seem to have anything to do with each other, we see significantly higher rates during adolescence than we see during childhood or during adulthood. Now, we've been trying to understand this in our lab at Temple for the last 20 years or so, and we've looked at both brain science and psychological science to try to explain why risk-taking peaks during adolescence. So let me tell you a little bit about we and what other scientists have been finding in this realm. Brain development is ongoing during adolescence, and as we now know, continues even beyond adolescence into the early 20s. We don't know exactly when brain maturation concludes. It's hard to say because the brain does not develop along a single timetable. Different brain regions develop at different times and at different rates. But I think the consensus is that certainly there is brain development continuing during adolescence, and there is brain development in some aspects of the brain that go on between the ages of 20 and 24 or 25. This is a marked change in what we think about brain development. When I did my graduate training in the 1970s, it was widely believed that the brain was mature by the time we were 10 years old, because the brain actually reaches its adult size by that age. But with the advent of imaging technologies, fMRI being the most important, we began looking inside the brain to see if there were age differences in how the brain functioned and in the internal structure of the brain rather than the simple mass of the brain. And we see that there are some important changes that take place during adolescence. One of the most important changes is described in this bullet point. adolescence is a time when we see the arousal of brain systems that govern incentive processing, that is, our experience of reward and punishment. These same brain systems govern our emotional experience, that is, our emotions as well as our perceptions of other emotions, and in processing social information, our awareness of what other people are doing and thinking and where we stand in their eyes. And what we know now is that the onset of puberty has important effects on the brain that arouse these brain systems. Now, most of you think of puberty as something that changes the physical appearance of the adolescent, the sex drive, and the internal organs. But what we now know is that these same sex hormones have a profound impact on the brain. And one of the most interesting effects of these sex hormones on the brain is to make this region of the brain, which is in the limbic system, much more easily aroused. We've been especially interested in the arousal of brain regions that govern our experience of reward or pleasure. There is an increase in dopamine activity in the brain's reward centers during adolescence that makes good things feel even better. Now, this is important because this occurs against a backdrop of still developing self-regulation. So even though adolescence is a time in which individuals are often engaged in the pursuit of rewarding and exciting experiences, they don't yet have the capacity to regulate their behavior in a totally mature way. And it's this combination of an easily aroused reward system and still developing self-control that makes adolescents so prone to risky and reckless behavior. Because people tend to focus on the potential rewards of a risky choice and don't pay attention to the downside, and they have a hard time controlling the urges to pursue those exciting and novel and potentially pleasurable experiences. What we've shown in our work is that this imbalance between these easily aroused systems and self-control is greatest in middle adolescence. And this period, roughly, let's say, from 15 to 18 or 19, is a period of heightened vulnerability to risky behavior and many, many forms of psychopathology. What happens as individuals mature into adulthood is that their tendency to become aroused declines, and at the same time, their ability to regulate their impulses improves. And so risky behavior and reckless behavior diminish as individuals mature from adolescence into adulthood because of both of these changes. That is, people become less sensitive to rewards, less inclined to go after them, and more able at regulating their impulses and their behavior. And we now have converging evidence of this story from neuroscientific, neuropsychological, and behavioral studies of people of different ages. We've been studying this in our lab, and we use a theoretical framework that we call the dual systems model. This is a hypothetical graph that shows you the developmental trajectories of these two different brain systems. And what you see is in green is the reward processing system, which increases in its strength and its arousability until this period in middle to late adolescence, and then falls off as individuals mature, as opposed to the maturation of self-regulation, which is protracted and gradual and linear over time. What you find is that there is a window of vulnerability in here when arousability of the reward-seeking system is very high and maturation of impulse control systems are still taking place. These are data that we analyzed from a large study, 7,000 individuals of people in America of different ages. It's from the Children of the National Longitudinal Study of Youth. That survey included measures of both impulse control, shown here in yellow, and sensation seeking, shown in blue. And what you see is that this sensation seeking follows this inverted U-shaped curve, just as we would predict based on what we know about dopamine and its effects on the brain. And then impulse control matures gradually in a linear fashion. So this makes this period of time in here a vulnerable time. We often talk about it as a time when the accelerator is pressed down to the floor before there's a good braking system in place. Now, when we began publishing that work, a lot of people asked whether this is a pattern that is unique to American individuals, that's where we had done our initial studies, or whether we see this around the world. And with funding from the Jacobs Foundation, which is based in Switzerland, we were able to replicate much of the work that we've done in the United States in these other countries. And I think you'll agree, looking at the list here, that this is a very varied group of countries that range from some very affluent ones like Sweden to some very poor ones like Kenya and Jordan. And we took the same measures, both computer tasks as well as self-report measures that we had been using in the United States, and we replicated that research in these 11 countries. This is not yet published. There's a paper that's under review and that we hope will be out soon. So you're getting a sneak peek at some very, very new findings here. We use multiple measures to look at manifestations of this incentive processing, reward processing system. And we try to measure it at the neurobiological level by measuring how sensitive people are to reward. At the psychological level, by asking how much they're inclined to engage in sensation seeking, and at the behavioral level, by looking at actual reward seeking behavior. Let me show you a little bit about how we measure these things. Now, we measure sensitivity to reward using a task called the Iowa gambling task, in which you're presented with 4 different decks of cards and asked to play or pass on each deck. And the decks are structured so that 2 of them are advantageous ones, that if you pick from them, you win over time, and 2 of them are disadvantageous. That is, if you pick from them, you lose from them over time. The trick is that the disadvantageous decks have occasional very high rewards. For individuals who are very reward sensitive, they tend to be drawn to the decks that provide them with rewards rather than punishment. And so we develop a measure of reward sensitivity that's based on changes in plays from the advantageous decks over time. We measure sensation seeking using a self-report measure in which individuals answer questions like those here on the screen. I like doing things just for the thrill of it. I sometimes do crazy things just for fun. And that is our self-report measure of the psychological construct of sensation seeking. And we measure actual reward seeking using a game that we developed at Temple called the stoplight task. Now, for those of you who drive, the dilemma that this task puts people in will seem very familiar to you. We've all had the experience of being in a car and driving and trying to get someplace in a hurry and encountering a yellow light and deciding whether to try to make it through that light or not. So we developed a game in which individuals are motivated through the prospect of earning more money to finish this driving course as quickly as possible. They drive down a road and encounter a series of intersections where the light is yellow. And the only decision that they have to make is whether to brake or not brake when they come to that intersection. And we explain to them that 3 things can happen. They can brake and lose time off the clock. They can make it through successfully and not lose any time at all, or they can run the light and crash and they lose a lot of time off of the clock. And risky driving is our measure, and it is correlated with self-reported sensation seeking, but not impulsivity. So this is a measure of how motivated people are to get that reward that they think they're going to get by finishing the course quickly. So we combine these 3 measures, the Iowa gambling task, the sensation seeking questionnaire, and the stoplight task to a measure of sensation seeking. And here's what we have in our international sample. So remember, these are individuals between the ages of 10 and 30 in 11 very different countries. The sample size was about 5,500 people, equal numbers of men and women or boys and girls. and equal numbers of people from each country. And what you see here is a remarkably similar pattern to what we've seen in American samples, with sensation seeking increasing in this international sample, peaking here around ages 18 or 19, and then declining into adulthood. So this is pretty astounding to us to find that the same pattern of development in this respect that we have seen in American samples is evident around the world. And here you see some of the countries' lines graphed independently. And you see this inverted U-shaped curve for many of the countries in our sample. So this idea that people at the age of 17, 18, 19, and so forth tend to be very high in sensation seeking and reward seeking, that this does not just describe American adolescence. The black line here, for example, is from our sample of Chinese individuals. And it's the same pattern that we see in the United States and that we see in many of the other countries in our sample. So we're confident that this aspect of the dual systems framework has some universality to it. Now, we also measure self-regulation. That's the other part of the dual systems framework. And we do that, again, at a neurobiological level by measuring response inhibition. That's the ability to stop yourself from doing something. At the psychological level, by looking at planning, and at a behavioral level, by looking at how well people control their impulses. So our measure of response inhibition is the Stroop test. What you're asked to do is to press the button that matches the color of the word while ignoring what the word says. So in this trial, you would press the yellow button because that's the color that the word appears in. And of course, everybody is tempted to press the red button when you see the word red. So you have to inhibit that response. And we measure how well people are able to do that. We also have a self-report measure of planning that asks people how much they engage in things like thinking ahead. And that is our parallel measure to our self-report measure of sensation seeking. And we measure impulse control by using a task called the Tower of London. And in this task, you're shown a start configuration of these colored balls and a goal configuration, and you're asked to move the balls onto and back and forth between these pegs so that you can change this configuration into the goal configuration. Our measure of impulse control here is how long people wait before making their first move when they encounter difficult problems. Because if you behave impulsively and make a bad first move, it's going to interfere with your ability to solve the task in the fewest number of moves that's possible. And as with our measure of reward seeking, sensation seeking, we make a composite measure from these three indicators. And here what you see is, again, very similar to what we saw in the American sample, that self-regulation in our international sample increases steadily throughout adolescence. It reaches its plateau somewhere here in the early to mid-20s, and then stays pretty much at this level. So adolescence around the world is a time of increased self-regulation. And again, we see this increase during adolescence in virtually all of the countries in our sample. In some countries, the plateau is more evident than it is in others, but if you focus on the period from 10 to 22 or so, what you see is that self-regulation improves steadily in all these different countries. So this is confirmation for what our theory says about why adolescents engage in such risky and reckless behavior. Turn to the topic of brain plasticity. The brain, as I mentioned before, is a dynamic organ. It changes in response to experience. But some periods of brain development are more malleable than others, and different parts of the brain are more plastic or more malleable at different ages. Now, these changes that take place in the brain occur through both genetically programmed maturation, that is, some aspects of brain development have nothing to do with experience, but a lot of aspects of brain development occur in response to experience. So when we talk about the maturation, let's say, of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's important for self-control, we're talking about a part of the brain that matures, both because it's genetically programmed to do so, but also in response to experience that ask individuals to engage in more self-regulation and self-control. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, we know that brain plasticity is very evident early in life in what we call 0 to 3, but it's also very significant during adolescence. And this notion that there are two periods of brain plasticity is a relatively new one, but it really should change the way that we think about adolescence, and to think that adolescence is a second 0 to 3, as I'll talk about in a moment. Now, the brain, of course, is always capable of change. If it wasn't capable of change during adulthood, we wouldn't be able to learn anything. But there are two different types of plasticity that characterize development at different periods of time. There's developmental plasticity, which involves very large-scale changes in the structure of neural circuitry. This is going on during infancy, childhood, and adolescence, when the brain is being rewired. But then there's also adult plasticity, which involves very small-scale modifications of existing neural circuits. The changes are very small and very minor. So even though you've probably all seen these infomercials that tell you that you can change your brain, the fact of the matter is that you can't change it very much after adolescence. What this means is that adolescence is the last period of developmental plasticity. It's the last time when the brain will ever be that malleable. And as I said when I began this lecture, plasticity makes adolescence a time of both vulnerability and opportunity. What that means for those of us who are educators and practitioners and parents is that we need to do what we can to protect the adolescent brain from toxic experiences because it is so vulnerable to them. But we also need to provide opportunities for brain growth and brain development during this time because the brain is so malleable and so responsive to experience. So adolescence is another 0 to 3. It's another time when we should think about making a concerted effort to invest in development during this period of time. And we know that it's a time of profound changes in emotional and behavioral and intellectual functioning. And we know that there is dramatic remodeling of multiple brain systems. And we know that there's increased sensitivity to the environment. The reminiscence bump refers to the fact that people remember adolescence and things that happened then better than remember other periods of development. The adolescent brain is also more responsive to stress than the child brain or the adult brain is. So what studies show is that the same amount of stress has more harmful consequences during adolescence than it does during the elementary school years or during adulthood. And that's because the hormones of puberty, which I talked about before as being so important for brain changing, the hormones of puberty make the brain more stress responsive as well. It is a time when individuals seem to be particularly attentive to social information, to what's going on in the social world around them. It's a time of dramatically heightened susceptibility to addiction. So we know that individuals who start using recreational drugs before the age of 15 are 10 times more likely to develop an addiction or substance abuse disorder than individuals who use the very same substances in the same amount but delay their use until they're 21 years old. So there's a good reason why we have the age boundaries that we do, separating individuals who are legally permitted to buy alcohol and in some states marijuana and those who are not. This is not, by the way, because people who start using drugs early are different in some fundamental way, because we know from animal studies that animals who've been randomly assigned to be exposed to these substances right after they've gone through puberty are also much more likely than animals who aren't exposed until they're adults to develop addiction. And of importance to all of you in today's audience is that adolescence is the most common period for the onset of a serious psychiatric disorder. Across all psychiatric disorders, the average age of onset is 14. And this graph shows that across all these very different types of disorders, there is a period of time where their age of onset overlaps, and that period of time is in middle adolescence. So, in addition to the fact that adolescence is the time when plasticity has been increasing, we also know that there's a decline in plasticity during the transition to adulthood. And very recent studies have shown that there actually is a change in the chemical climate of the brain that changes the brain's tendency to be plastic and malleable to instead be stable in the face of experiences. And so what we see after adolescence is synaptic stability in the context of continued myelination. So what do we know about this window of plasticity and what opens and closes it? We think that this increase in plasticity is sparked by puberty and the impact of sex hormones on the brain, but it may be the case that the decrease in plasticity as we transition into adulthood may be dependent on context. When individuals leave adolescence and enter the roles of adulthood, they tend to enter roles that expose them to much more repetitive and routine day-to-day experiences. And that may signal the brain to become more stable and less malleable. Now, the fact that the brain is very plastic in adolescence makes a lot of evolutionary sense. Adolescence in all mammals is a time when juveniles leave the adults that have taken care of them and protected them and venture out on their own to establish independence. So it makes perfect sense that the brain should be wired to be very malleable in the face of experience during this time so that individuals can learn about their environment at a time when such learning is so important to developing independence in a safe way. So one thing we've wondered, and we don't know the answer to this, is whether the window of plasticity can be kept open longer by continuing to expose young people to novelty and to challenge and change. So let's just talk very briefly about the fact that adolescence now is so much longer than it's ever been before. Those of us who study adolescence like to say that adolescence begins in biology and it ends in culture. It begins with the onset of puberty and it ends when individuals enter into the main roles of adulthood. And by those two markers, what we see is that adolescence is starting much earlier and it's lasting much longer. So just as an illustration, we'll take the ages at which young adolescent girls get their first period, menarche, and we'll look at the ages at which individuals get married. Now, I'm not saying that one needs to be married to be an adult. What I am saying is that if you were interested in asking at a societal level whether the age at which people are moving from adolescence into adulthood has changed, the age of marriage isn't a bad marker of that. So what we see is that the biological beginning of adolescence, the age of puberty, is getting earlier, and it has been getting earlier for as long as we've been measuring it. It has been falling by about 3 to 4 months per decade, and the drop in the age of puberty has been going on for boys as well as girls. At the beginning of the 20th century, the average American girl got her first period when she was 14 and a half, and today it's close to 12. But at the same time that this is happening, the cultural completion of adolescence is progressively later. It's becoming later by about 12 months per decade. And again, it is comparable for males and females. So here's what I'm talking about graphed out here. In 1840, you can see that the length of adolescence is relatively short in terms of the timing of the age of menarche and the timing of the age of marriage, and look at that compared to today. So adolescence today is 3 times as long as it was in the 1840s, and it's twice as long as it was as recently as 1950. By my estimate, adolescence is probably a 15-year-long period nowadays. One interesting illustration of this, those of you who are parents of young people certainly have experienced this firsthand, I'm sure, is the changes in economic dependence on parents. So let's just look at the age 23 data here. These are graduating classes that go from the 1970s up to more recent time. And this is the percentage of people this age who are receiving income from their parents. And what you see is that back in the 1970s, only about half of 23-year-olds were getting money from their parents, and it's about 3/4 of them now. These are the data for males, but the data from females tell a similar story. Back in the 1970s, 23-year-olds were about 40% of them were getting money from their parents, and now it's closer to 70%. So there's no question that adolescents are staying economically dependent on their parents longer. That's another indicator of how much adolescence has been lengthened. Now, it's longer because it's dropped at the front end, that is, puberty occurs earlier because it's connected with obesity, exposure to endocrine disruptors, exposure to light, father absence, and the survival of premature babies. But it's delaying the transition into adulthood because of the growing demands for higher education, which keep people economically dependent on their parents longer, the higher cost of housing, which makes it harder to move away from home, and changes in the status and economic power of young women. We don't see changes in the attitudes and values of young adults that would suggest that they're choosing to take more time before becoming adults. In fact, it seems to be a response mainly to the demands for higher education. So what does this mean? It means that there's a longer period of maturational imbalance, a longer period during which there is this high sensation-seeking against the backdrop of immature self-regulation. And it means that helping people develop self-regulation is that much more important. It also means that there's a longer period of neuroplasticity. And that means that we have increased opportunity for intervention. And we know that plasticity, as I mentioned before, is mostly centered in the self-regulatory systems of the brain, so we can do something to help strengthen people's self-control and self-regulation. But that there is a longer period of vulnerability during which young people need our guidance and need our protection. And of course, context matters. The context in which people grow up determines whether adolescence is going to be a time of opportunity or whether it's going to be a time of vulnerability. I don't think it's necessarily bad that individuals are taking longer to become adults. We don't see any evidence, as I said before, that today's young people are choosing to become adults at a later age. And in fact, it may be the case that prolonging adolescence may actually prolong brain plasticity for a little bit longer, because prolonging adolescence may increase the exposure of young people to novel experiences and keep the brain more malleable. And so I think the wrong question is whether delaying adulthood is bad. That's the question that the popular media likes to ask. And the right question is, how can we create opportunities for more individuals to take advantage of the brain plasticity that delayed adulthood affords them? So I want to conclude there, and we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. And the question period is going to be moderated by our host from DIBEL. But I want to thank you all for your attention, and I hope that this has been an enlightening experience for you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Steinberg. And all of you who may have jotted down questions, if you could kindly enter them into your question box, and I will be able to read them onto and share them with Dr. Steinberg. I do want to say to Gaston Miner that yes, we do have certificates available for professional development, and anyone who needs one can email Kathy at dibelinstitute.org, and her address will be on the last slide for this presentation before we end. And also that to reiterate that this webinar is going to be archived and on our webinar site page on our website. So let's see. Donna is asking Dr. If I can get this, open this up. Kathy, can you help me here? I'm having trouble opening up the
Yes, I'm
questions.
sorry. I was doing that. I was working on that.
Oh, here it is.
She
I
wants
have
to know,
it.
do you have a few, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Do you have a few suggestions for teaching in the longer, quote, longer decade?
Well, my suggestion is that we need to keep exposing young people to novel and challenging experiences for a longer period of time. As I discussed in Age of Opportunity, one of the striking findings from research on American high school students is how boring they say that high school is. And that is in comparison to what we hear from elementary and middle school students, but it's also in comparison to what we hear from high school students in other parts of the world. And American high schools are among the most boring that you see around the world. It seems such a shame that at a time when the brain is still so malleable and susceptible to experience, that the main educational institution that's serving young people, the high school, is not providing them with the kinds of challenge that would allow us to take advantage of the brain plasticity. And I think that this is probably true for many of our colleges as well. So we really need to understand and appreciate how important it is to take advantage of the brain's plastic nature during adolescence, and the brain plasticity that extends not only through the teen years, but into the early and perhaps even the mid-20s.
Okay, is that helpful, what you were looking for, Donna? I know that in Dr. Steinberg's book, he does have quite an elaborate list of ideas and elaborates on ideas about our education and as teachers. Isn't that correct, Dr. Steinberg?
Yes, it is.
How
that
we
is true.
In our, which I found very helpful myself. And I think even adding to opportunities for students to exercise as applications practice for self-regulation is an important aspect of it. Any other questions that I can answer, or that Dr. Steinberg can answer?
There's one here. What is going on in Jordan with the increased slope throughout adolescence?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand the question.
Sorry. What is going on in the country Jordan with the increased slope throughout adolescence?
The increased slope in what?
It says just the increased slope throughout adolescence.
I need some. I need the question to be more specific to understand it.
Thank you, Stephanie. Can you write a little bit more in there? Okay. How do we implement this new science into the juvenile justice systems?
Well, it already is beginning to be implemented in some respects, in that the Supreme Court, of course, has abolished the juvenile death penalty and placed limits on the use of life without parole as a sentence for young people. And now there is increased interest in looking at how the justice system treats people between the ages of 18 and 24, now that we recognize that this is a time during which the brain is very plastic and very malleable. So there's a lot of discussion about how best to do this. There are some people, I'm not one of them, but there are some people who've called for now processing 18 to 24-year-olds in the juvenile justice system instead of the criminal justice system. And there are others, and I would be in this latter group, who believe that we maybe need a separate way of dealing with young adults that distinguishes them from both juveniles and from adults, and that meets their developmental needs in an age-appropriate way. But so this is a discussion that's going on all over the country right now.
Okay, great. So my question, this is Kathy, so to kind of go on to the back end of that question, how do we get society to kind of catch up with this elongated adolescent when it comes to things like, um, private doctor privilege between, 18-year-olds and parents can't get that kind of information. So how do you see that coming, that maybe we can get society in general to catch up with 18 as not an adult?
Well, it's already the case, of course, that 18-year-olds are entitled to privacy when they seek health care, that their parents don't have a right, because the 18-year-olds, after all, are adults. But I think there's the broader question of coming to terms with the fact that what it means to be 18 today or 20 today is very different than what it meant to be 18 or 20 when we used those ages to divide adolescence from adulthood as developmental periods. And this recognition is slowly creeping into the public discussion. It actually is occurring probably more within the juvenile justice frame than anywhere else. But the Institute of Medicine of the National Academies issued a report, let's see, I think it was in 2015, devoted to the mental and physical health of young adults in America. And I think that this, again, is drawing attention to this age as a vulnerable period, because I don't think that most people have recognized that that adolescence now extends much longer, that means that the brain's malleability lasts that much longer, and that the window of vulnerability doesn't end when people turn 18, but continues during the first half of the 20s as well. So there's a lot of discussion of this issue going on, and as I'm sure you know, it often takes a long time to get from a discussion to actual changes in policy and practice, but people are talking about it.
Right. Anna Marie is asking, she's excited that you're speaking. Her question is, how is it best to help the families intervene in a teenager's life who are engaging in truancy, absenteeism from school, and low-level criminal behavior to change the course of action? And how about
I think that we know that programs that involve parents in treating kids who are engaged in minor delinquency are among the most successful that we have. So a good example of that many in the audience will be familiar with is MST, and that's a program that doesn't just focus on the juvenile, but focuses on the family and the community context of the young person too. So I think it's very important that when an adolescent is exhibiting signs of acting out, or behavioral problems, to involve the parents in whatever treatment program is being developed, because the evidence-based practice literature suggests that those programs are far more effective.
Well, and Kathy, do you see here also Stephanie, I think, clarified her question about the graph. She said that she believes it was sensation seeking. That was the graph that was shown that I guess Jordan was higher on. The different countries showed the inverse U-shaped curve for all countries except Jordan.
Well, it could be the case that in societies that place a lot of restrictions on young people's behavior, that adolescence is less of a time during which they engage in these novelty-seeking, sensation-seeking acts. Young people in Jordan are chaperoned much more closely and monitored much more closely than they are in many of the other countries that we studied. And that would lead, I think, to making adolescence less of a kind of free period during which people can seek rewards and go after exciting experiences, because a lot of that behavior occurs when adults aren't around.
And I guess here's, I guess someone, I don't see that question on here anymore, but I guess a reference to looking back in other times that we, young people were marrying much earlier than they are today. And maybe even situations, and I'm thinking even today, young people are forced to grow up sooner, given circumstances. For example, I'm thinking single parents having children who the child has to be maybe more grown up, take more responsibility in the family for some families, and also maybe children or young teens who marry earlier. How does that impact, that experience impact their transition into adulthood, and also the plasticity of the brain? What does that experience do for them?
Well, it's a great question. We don't know the answer to that, but let me tell you what I've speculated. This notion that novel and challenging experience keeps the brain plastic longer suggests that entering into the roles of adulthood at an earlier age is probably not good for the brain. And so to the extent that kids in certain circumstances are forced to become adults faster at an earlier age, I think that probably doesn't bode well for their subsequent brain development. And as I discuss in the book, of course, there are huge issues of income inequality here to be contended with, because youngsters growing up in poverty are much more likely to be forced into these roles of adulthood at an earlier age than youngsters who grew up amidst more affluence. So I think just as I would say we don't want to push people into adulthood too early, we also don't want people to grow up in situations in which they're going to be forced into adulthood too early.
Well, and that certainly, I think, can impact our programming. How we prepare them for adulthood, how we expose them to certain skills, social skills, and social emotional education skills to prepare them better, that they have more self-confidence going into adulthood, could help them. Is that a good
I think so.
Outcome for that? Well, we are at 5 o'clock already. That went awfully quickly. We want to get on to, thank you. There's a brief survey after the end of this webinar. Please, we value your feedback. And this will be available again in 3 days. So please check our archive page so that you can revisit, take notes. We do not have any handouts, and you will be able to only have access to the PowerPoints through the webinar viewing. Keep in touch with us at Dibble Institute. Subscribe to our newsletter. Like us on Facebook, LinkedIn. Here's our office phone number. My email and Kathy's. If you need a professional development certificate, please ask Kathy. We'll be happy to send that to you. And I can't thank you enough, Dr. Steinberg, for sharing with us all your valuable information. And again, I strongly recommend that you look at Dr. Laurence's book and pick it up, because there is so much more in it than we could have time to cover today. Dr. Steinberg, you're wonderful. Thank you again. And thank you all for all the work you are doing with young people. We applaud you, we thank you, and we wish you the best success. Thank you
very
again.
much. Thank you.
You're
Bye-bye,
quite
everybody.
welcome.
You will.